come out of it, still believing your best players?
Well, Peter Dutton says he wants the electorate to know more about him, that he has a softer side. With speculation continuing that there will be another challenge, the question remains, is he electable as Prime Minister, and can he save seats in his crucial home state of Queensland? All the issues we're going to be discussing with our panel. I'm joined now from Bowral in regional New South Wales by former Federal Liberal Party leader John Hewson. Bruce Hawker is a Labor campaign strategist who played a key role in the election campaign of Kevin Rudd. He's in Sydney and Canberra, and in Canberra is Steve Dickson, One Nation's Queensland leader. Great to have all of you on the program. John, I'll start with you. Even those who were probably expecting something to happen would concede that it happened more quickly than it would have been thought. What was going through your mind this morning when you heard that the vote had been called on?
Well, I wasn't surprised that Turnbull called it on in the sense that it had been building for some time. But I think the plotters probably thought they had a bit longer. He turned it on, and I think probably was a bit surprised that they got 35 votes against his 48, a margin of 7. But as you've been saying, it's certainly not over. That's stage one.
Well, not just not over, John. Is it inevitable? Is there an inevitability about this now that not only will there be another challenge, but it will be successful?
Well, it's very hard to see that there won't be another challenge, and it's not hard to see that in the end it'll probably be successful. This looks orchestrated. We have the vote, then we have a succession of ministers. Admittedly, at this stage, just junior ministers, one after the other pulling out. But, and it could happen very quickly. I mean, Malcolm will try and drag it out, I suppose, as long as he can, but I think they've probably taken the view that, look, it's happened, we've got a pretty good base. They might even go as early as Thursday of this week rather than wait to the end of the parliament or the beginning of next week. So, it's going to happen. But I don't think necessarily, myself, that it'll just be Dutton. I mean, if it comes back to another spill motion, another vote, I think you'll get some other candidates putting up their hand. And I would like myself to see others put their hand up. If you're going to have that contest, we'll have it. And I'd encourage people like Julie Bishop to actually make us down. Probably the last thing she wants to do, but I mean, it's the sort of thing that I think would make a big difference. And what's your end game? If your end game is to beat Shorten, who's the best candidate to do that? That's the sort of thinking they've got to go through. While Dutton will bring seats, I'm sure, in Queensland, he'll probably lose them in Sydney and Melbourne.
I do want to explore that a little bit later. And Bruce Hawker, I suppose right now, you and others in the Labor Party would be planning on facing Peter Dutton, wouldn't you, at the next election?
Well, I think that's the most likely at the moment, Stan. Not necessarily, as John said, there could be a compromise candidate put up by Turnbull if he thinks that it's all over for him. But I think what we're seeing right now is what I call the drip. One by one, these people are withdrawing from the ministry and applying what I call psychological pressure on the waverers. And we saw that, for example, when Rudd was deposed by Gillard. At first people say they're going to stick by you, but then as the momentum builds, panic sets in and people just desert in droves. And I think this is what the Dutton people are trying to do right now, create a sense of inevitability. And if you don't get on board, you might miss out on a portfolio or some other perk.
Yeah, but Bruce, it must be going through your mind today. You think about this and you go, well, the rot started, of course, with the candidate you helped get into the lodge, Kevin Rudd, and then Julia Gillard, and then back to Kevin Rudd, and then Tony Abbott, and then Malcolm Turnbull, and now potentially Peter Dutton. What is wrong with our politics right now? We didn't go through the worst of the global financial crisis. We don't have the problems that Europe and the United States has. Our economy is growing. We are growing jobs. Why do we see this?
Well, I think part of it on the Liberal side, and we're looking at that right now.
Or both sides, to be honest, but is there something rotten with the system?
Well, I think there is, and of course the Labor Party under Rudd tried to put in place and have put in place some measures to protect the leader from these sorts of pressures.
And 3 weeks ago they were talking about Albanese challenging Shorten if Shorten didn't do well at the by-election. So that's no guarantee either, even with those changes you put in place.
It's not a guarantee, but at least it's a recognition that you need to have some stability in the leadership. And of course, one of the reasons why Labor's going well now compared to when we had Gillard Rudd is that they have demonstrated a fair degree of stability. I think, though, on the Liberal Party side, we see much more doctrinaire politics creeping into what was once a very pragmatic party, driven largely by Tony Abbott, and that has been a destabiliser.
And that's a good point to bring Steve Dickson here, because, Steve, I would suspect that as you watch this, you'd be thinking, well, this is the One Nation effect, isn't it? That One Nation has taken voters away from that conservative end of the Liberal Party. It's talked about a lot, and the argument here is that the Liberal Party needs to recover that base. One Nation is helping to create this.
Stan, and thanks for having me on the show tonight. I think this gets down to people have pretty well had a gutful of politics, and they've had a gutful of it for some of the reasons being demonstrated by the first two speakers. You know, there is no stability with leadership. We need people who are going to build nation-building projects. We need people who have a vision for the future of this country. But what we're seeing is people looking in the mirror. They're reflecting upon themselves. They're talking about themselves. And don't discard Labor. They're exactly the same. They'll drive up the cost of energy. And all of those things are going to happen. But we need people who are going to represent the people.
But One Nation, Steve, has tapped into something. We saw it in the Longman by-election. We've seen it in other elections in recent times. We've seen that state elections, not necessarily transferring into seats, but that taking away that vote from the Conservatives and driving the Liberal Party to a more conservative base. What are people looking for then?
Stan, it's pretty straight up and down. We've got some very straightforward policies, and media don't talk about them a lot, but we're the only party talking about cutting immigration. We were the only party talking about coal-fired power stations. We're the sort of party who wants to cut back on our debt. We're the sort of party who wants to start taxing the top 732 multinational companies. People are coming to us in droves. I'm an ex-Liberal. I helped form the LNP in Queensland, and it's proven nothing to be but a disaster. And the problem is they're eating their own. You know, people like James McGrath, he actually stabbed Tony Abbott in the back and did the numbers for Malcolm Turnbull, and we've seen that with Ted O'Brien. They're just local blokes up our way. I mean, what are they going to do to the next bloke? How many prime ministers are we going to have?
Yeah, I want to come back to you on this question in a minute, but I just want to ask John Hewson, before we do, I'm just hearing, John, as well, that Michael Keenan now may have offered his resignation, but that hasn't been accepted.
I hear that, yes.
Yeah, and that hasn't been accepted by Malcolm Turnbull. But this idea that the Liberal Party needs to recapture a conservative base, was the Liberal Party ever meant to be a conservative party? John Howard used to talk about the broad church. You know, Robert Menzies talked about the forgotten people. It was more of a liberal, small L party, wasn't it, than a conservative party?
Well, I think John Howard did talk about the broad church, but he tended to govern onto the right-hand side of the pulpit, if you like to say. He had a conservative bent. I've got a very strong view, though, that a hardline right conservative would not win in Australia. If you give up the centre ground and perhaps some of the left, you are not going to win enough votes across Australia to actually gain government. And this idea that we've got to match the One Nation Party, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, is that a race to the bottom? The One Nation Party, to me, has been essentially a protest mechanism. I mean, a lot of people who vote One Nation don't ever expect that One Nation will govern. You saw that with Xenophon. I mean, he was a master of the stunt and the soundbite. But as soon as it looked like he might win in South Australia, the vote collapsed. I think the same is true of One Nation. So I wouldn't be running a major political party on the basis of a fringe party, trying to match a fringe party. And if that's what's driving them in terms of their anti-immigration stance and some of the other statements they're making in favour of coal-fired power stations and more dams and so on, I mean, I'd be very suspicious of that motivation. And it will cost them seats in Sydney and Melbourne.
But Bruce Hawker, what has also been a feature of politics of recent times is that even if you do win office, you can't govern. You can't bring about the reforms that you want. You can't implement the policies you want, precisely because we have this fractured polity right now, and we do have independents and we do have minor parties. So where does that position Labor right now?
Well, it makes it difficult unless you actually get a decent majority, certainly in the lower house. You can generally work through a negotiation in the upper house.
But we haven't seen that since Kevin Rudd. So now the reality is you don't have that decent majority, do you?
No, you don't. And I think that is one of the problems. But if one of the parties does get a significant majority, then that problem goes away. But the reason that they're not getting these majorities is essentially, I think, because a large section of the electorate is disillusioned with what they see as being the swamp, as Donald Trump would call it, the insiders governing for Canberra and from Canberra rather than for the whole electorate. And Labor has to deal with that issue itself. I've conducted my own polling on this issue and found that 47% of the electorate have either disillusioned with the major parties and would look to minor parties like One Nation, or have actually moved that way. So Labor, and I can only speak from that perspective, really needs to seriously engage with the sort of people who are going over to One Nation and start to listen to some of their concerns.
Let's have a look at the two men that we've been talking about specifically today, Peter Dutton and Malcolm Turnbull. And Steve, Peter Dutton, a part of the rationale here is that he will put a plank underneath Queensland, that basically he can hold on to those seats, that they won't bleed all the seats potentially they would otherwise in Queensland under Malcolm Turnbull. Do you see that? Do you see his appeal there and being able to deliver that?
Well, to the diehard Liberals in Queensland, probably. But the issue is, I think it's much deeper than that, Stan, and you touched on it. People losing touch with those two major parties, and I really think that John got it wrong. I think the world is changing dramatically. We have preferential, or I should say proportional representation voting throughout the world now, and when you look at those minor parties, they're not getting that representation that people are actually voting for in the parliament. I mean, we achieved 13.75% of the vote in Queensland.
In the state election,
we ended up with one seat. Yeah. Because of the system that's in place. Now, it's the boys' club, it's the right wing and left wing in politics. The problem is it belongs to the same bloody bird.
And the issue here too is that you can't direct your voters' preferences either. Well, so you can't say, look, if they were all going to go to the Liberals, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem in Queensland, would it? Stan,
people don't understand in preferential voting, people don't own, we don't own their vote. The Labor Party doesn't own it, the Liberal Party doesn't own it, One Nation doesn't. You vote for who you want to vote for. We'd just like you to vote number one for One Nation. We're pretty happy about that. So
Peter Dutton potentially holding Queensland. John Hewson, Malcolm Turnbull. Remember, when he was stalking Tony Abbott and he was on Q&A and it was leather jacket Malcolm and he was talking about climate change and he was talking about same-sex marriage and he had a lot of support. There was a sigh of relief amongst many once he became Prime Minister that this was meant to be the new change, the break with the turmoil of recent times. What went wrong?
Well, that's right. I mean, Stanley definitely came in with very high expectations. I think perhaps too high, but I mean, people did believe that Malcolm had a policy agenda, that he believed in issues like, a substantive response to climate change, that he believed in same-sex marriage, that he believed in tax reform and a number of other issues on which he'd taken positions over the years. Yet if you look at when he took them and how he took them, mostly he was differentiating his product from somebody else. He wasn't actually saying that I believe in this is my policy agenda. So what he's done since he's been there is failed to deliver against those expectations. Initially, all options will be on the table. We'll have a restoration of cabinet government. We'll have no more slogans. We'll do substantive policy debates and so on. And all the options came off the table and we got very little progress. Most of the problems are being kicked down the road. And people are looking for authenticity. They're looking for outcomes and he's deliving neither. At the same time, I mean, there is a loss of...
I wonder though, John.
Loss of confidence in both major parties.
Are people looking for that? Or, where is the reward for a leader who does necessarily stand up for what they believe in, or who does try to prosecute a reform agenda? You'd remember yourself, wouldn't you, that when you were in opposition and lost the unlosable, as they said, precisely because you did go out there. But precisely because you did go
I'm
out
a
there.
great one to ask about this, but while it was important that governments focus on outcomes in the early 90s, it's much more important today. I mean, people are struggling. The average Australian is struggling with the cost of living. I mean, whether it's housing affordability or power prices or childcare or school fees or medical costs or medical insurance or whatever, those costs are going up faster than their wages, which are just flat. And what are governments doing? They're offering minimal tax relief. They're not trying to solve those problems. I mean, none of what's being said by either sides of politics is actually dealing with those issues and attempting to solve the problems. They're kicking them down the road. And it's why at the last election, 1 in 3 people did not vote for the two major parties. It is a problem for the major parties, and it has been true in Europe. It has been true in the United States, although Trump notionally ran as a Republican. I mean, the major parties, the political establishment, the political elite, the insiders, the swamp, are the problem. And that's what people are, you know, they're feeling disadvantaged, so they're reacting against it.
Bruce,
you've got to reposition yourself in that context.
Do you want to say something to that? And then I want to follow up with a question specifically about leadership.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I do think that the Labor Party particularly does have to look at the concerns of these people. The research that we did showed that amongst people who were voting One Nation, and immigration actually wasn't the number one issue. It was health, education, cost of living. And so there was a message there that they could listen to from the Labor Party if they were prepared to actually direct it towards them without compromising on those issues which One Nation is guilty of exploiting, race particularly. So I think that is a very important role for the Labor Party as they, as we enter into this next phase. And I think Bill Shorten needs to act like a statesman now. He doesn't have to be a hard-edged opposition leader for the right now. He actually has to look like the Prime Minister in waiting.
Well, Steve wants to respond to that, but it does raise a question here, Steve, and that is, you talk about authenticity, and Pauline Hanson is often said, part of the appeal is that she does have that authenticity. You talk about people wanting to abandon politics as usual and are sick of the swamp of politics, but does it also open the door for the type of uglier side of populism that we've seen in other parts of the world, and that race becomes an issue that, as we saw just last week with Fraser Anning, Pauline Hanson spoke out about that. But as we can see just how nasty a lot of the populist politics can become.
Stan, you've touched on a very, very important point. One Nation in particular, and John, I take offence to what you said. One Nation is talking about immigration for this particular reason. The Conservatives want to bring in 230,000 a year. Labor and the Greens, they want to bring in unlimited numbers into this country. You know why they're doing it? Because they're making a quid out of it. We can't cop the amount of population coming in here. We don't have the schools, we don't have the roads, we don't have the infrastructure. Our population has grown beyond the expectations of anybody within this country, and we don't have the jobs to cater for these people. Our debt has now reached nearly $600 billion. And John, I thought you're a bit of an economist. Obviously you're not, and the Libs have got it wrong, Labor's got it wrong. We have to cut back on immigration. Our policy is very clear. 75 in, 75,000 out. We cannot, and it's a hiatus. We need to take a deep breath.
Clearly what's happening now, John, and I don't get involved in the ins and outs of population and immigration policy, but there are a couple of issues here. Immigration is one of them, climate change, energy policy is another, that are as much about ideology as they are about policy, aren't they, John?
Well, there's an element of that. I mean, just on immigration, you cut immigration substantially, and I'm not against a debate on this, but if you cut it, you will reduce our growth rate and you will increase our debt. You'll increase the budget deficit. So the economics of it are pretty clear cut, and it's been demonstrated over a long, long period of time. The debate about climate isn't so much about ideology. The science is in, it's really uncontestable. The challenge is how we make the transition to a low-carbon society.
And that's been the failure.
Decades.
And that's been the failure of politics, hasn't it, Bruce? We're talking about leadership once again because we have seen a failure of policy to deliver on this. And I just want to touch on this, Bruce, as well to finish. when a leader is toppled, we saw it with Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. We saw it when Kevin Rudd came back. We saw it with Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott, and potentially Peter Dutton, if he becomes leader, will face the same thing. That you're poisoned at the well, aren't you? That you take the worst aspects of what came before, and it hobbles your own leadership. And partly that's what we've seen with Malcolm Turnbull, isn't it?
It is, and it's a case of deja vu all over again. You saw the sort of problems that Labor had being repeated by the Liberals with their challenges, and of course it all started when Abbott rolled Turnbull over climate and then forced Rudd into an ignominious retreat over trading, emissions trading. And this is the same issue that keeps coming up again and again. So I actually do think that there's a lot of ideology in this, even though the science is quite clear that we have to be seriously engaging on renewables and so forth to make sure that the planet survives, that we don't have the terrible, devastating floods and droughts and fires that we're seeing around the world. But the politicians have to be prepared to make a stand on that and say, if I'm going to be a one-term government, well, so be it. Whitlam did that, and the things that Whitlam did 40 years ago are still entrenched in our system because he fundamentally changed the country. You can do it in 3 years. You don't need 13 years in government to do it.
And as you remember, that came at a cost too, Bruce.
It did, of course.
Steve, I know you want to say something, but I promise we'll have you back on. It's always good to talk to you, Bruce. A pleasure to see you. And John, as always, thank you.
God bless you, Stan.
Well, it was a dispute over the government's national energy guarantee which led to today's leadership spill, a scenario which has played out, as we've heard, many times before. Malcolm Turnbull lost his job as opposition leader because of it. Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd also came undone over the same issue. Why is getting the policy settings right on energy so difficult in this country? Joining me from Canberra is Professor Frank